Hello and welcome to a special edition of the State of the Fleet Industry video series produced by Automotive Fleet Magazine. And this series is designed to put a spotlight on key leaders in today's fleet management industry. And today I have the honor to interview Jonathan Kamanns, Fleet Program Manager for CTE, who's going to talk to us about truck engineering. And in particular, he's going to talk to us about how to work with suppliers, your business leaders, and field operations to define for them and through them the business needs of your company in order to design the right tool, the right asset for your fleet application. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, Jonathan, and thanks for joining us today.
Mike, I appreciate it. How are you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, so it's been a while, as we mentioned. Yeah, it's been a while since we've seen one another. So it's very good then. But let's start the interview and go on based on your experience. You've worked at a variety of different companies. So I'd like to find out from you what you consider to be the best practices when organizing a truck engineering planning meeting. And you did this recently with CTE. And how do you go about ensuring that it's going to have a successful outcome? And likewise, what are the common mistakes that fleet managers may make when organizing this type of meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good question. I will tell you that coming to CTE and really kind of getting the lay of the land and understanding how the vehicles are used today, it was a dire need for us to get a truck engineering session together and really better understand not how we utilize the vehicles today, but how do we better utilize the vehicles for the 5-year, 10-year future of the organization. Some of those best practices, the first one is really plan in advance. If we think about all the things that we get involved in and all the priorities in an organization, you want to be able to drop a hold the date, numerous months in advance because of the key stakeholders that you need to have involved.
Mhm.
If you don't do that and you try to do it last minute, you're not going to get the same value from the session had you taken the time to at least hold their calendars out and available. And as we talk about key stakeholders, right, as a best practice, you're going to have two sets of people. You're going to have folks who want to be involved in the process and aren't key stakeholders. And you're going to have folks who aren't necessarily interested in being part of the process, but are your key stakeholders. Identifying that group and being able to have a conversation on both sides of that equation, being eloquent about why somebody isn't a key stakeholder, but they're still important, to a future decision at some point in time. Because at the end of the day, the stakeholders that you have readily available, whether it be your suppliers, your business leaders, your field leaders, or even your technicians, if you get non-key stakeholders involved, you're going to muddy the waters. And that's really one of those big mistakes in doing a truck engineering session is too many people, the wrong set of people. You end up with scope creep, stakeholder creep, and ultimately you don't wind up with the value at the end that you really need to get. Another piece is really to be completely transparent about why you're doing it, right? So in the fleet organization, in most fleet organizations, the field will always see you as the ivory tower or corporate, right, in how you approach it. So if the end goal is really to improve operations, right, improve safety, improve ergonomics, right, whatever those are, be readily transparent upfront to all of your stakeholders as to what the expectation is, so that as tangents begin, you get to go back to the lens that you originally created and everybody understands the process, the direction, and the lens that you're using to view it. And you don't wind up with some of those, hey, how do we have to table this thing to get back to it? Another piece is when you think about suppliers in a truck engineering session, we get really good at inviting the suppliers that we utilize today to our sessions, right? It's just natural. The piece that we don't do well, some because we don't want to mess with other suppliers or current suppliers, is we don't invite outside suppliers in. And that is one of the huge takeaways I have or recommendations I have for everyone is really find those suppliers who are really good at what they do and bring them in, whether you use them today or not, because the lens that they get to bring in, the other customers that they support will have already identified solutions that you're probably fighting with yourselves or your organization on, and you get past that milestone much quicker.
Totally
The
agree with you,
second,
by the way.
the secondary
Yeah.
benefit to that is really the current suppliers you have. Like, okay, let's build relationships. SRM is important to me, but if you're not opening up the conversation with other suppliers, you're probably not sure how well your current suppliers are still supporting you, right? even from a solution set, from process standardization, all that good stuff. The more eyes you have, the more influence you have, the better the result is for the organization.
Hmm.
And then probably finally for me is getting out into the field. It's really easy to sit in a corporate location and invite everybody to you. Where the magic happens though is after the first 2 hours of sitting in a conference room where you're at, it's time to go get in the business. Have locations identified, have technicians, key technicians identified, and be able to go out into the field and get real world feedback. When I say get out in the field, I mean all those suppliers, all those leaders, all those field managers that you've identified as your key stakeholders, get them out there. Your key stakeholders internal learn so much more when they just stand back and listen and take it in. And some of the questions that they had gone in with are already answered midway through that session
Hmm.
already.
So
And then,
go
go ahead.
ahead. No, no, finish with your train of thought.
Yeah, so the last one is really the follow up, and you have to be really smart about how you do this, right? So there's an expectation of everybody who attends that they're going to get some level of feedback as to what directional changes, right? What did you uncover? Set the expectation that there's an end of that initiative, or else you will field calls for the next 6 months about what you had done, in January. Have your report out, make sure everybody gets the pieces that they need, and then it just becomes business as usual as to what you do with the information.
That's a terrific, very comprehensive answer, and you covered all the bases there. One thing that did come to my mind, when you're talking about employing your diplomatic skills as to who to invite, who not to invite, and so on, what is the sweet spot? I mean, what would be, in your mind, the ideal number of participants in a meeting? I mean, I could see it, when you talk about vendor creep, user
Yep.
creep, and so on. What number should you be looking at?
So we capped at 50.
Hmm.
And what you have to do is you figure a third of that will come from within inside your organization. 2/3 of it will come from outside the organization. So suppliers that you have today and suppliers that you potentially want to do business with, they come in droves. They come in twos and threes. So it's important that you understand what that looks like.
Hmm.
However, the key to controlling that is employing them. So you get to pick people from each of your stakeholder groups to be the people who take notes, to be the people who take pictures, right? To be the people who record conversations that you have. Because if you think as a fleet team you're going to be able to do that as you're having all these conversations, it just doesn't exist. And it gives the suppliers and the other internal stakeholders a purpose. And it really level sets. This way, when you get back together, everybody has a piece that they're reporting out. They've been contributory to it.
Hmm.
But that's what we capped it at 50.
Yeah, but that's a great suggestion involving everybody and all these other aspects on bringing about a successful meeting. I like that approach. Um, you touched upon this other point earlier about, planning out what your product plans are going to be 5+ years in the future. And in reality, with the type of equipment that many fleet managers operate or yourself, and sometimes these assets are kept in service for, 10, 15 years. And so my question is, using this type of an engineering planning session, how do you're obviously going to uh, define the assets that are adequate for today's business. How do
Sure.
you ensure that that's going to continue to be true 10 to 15 years from now? And how do you plan for that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's probably one that's not answered perfectly across all organizations, right? I'll be the first person to tell you we don't have the answer, but I feel that we're probably closer than most organizations in getting there, right? So if you think about the way that the organization is set up, most organizations are set up, right? You have the operations part of the business and you have all the supporting functions across the organization. Creating multiple relationships in each of those functions is increasingly more important today than it's ever been before because of the pace of change of organization. So, for instance, generally when goals are set, you have operational goals that are set in the business and you have corporate goals that are set here in the functions. They don't always connect, right?
Hmm.
So your job as a fleet leader is to understand what all of those goals are, right? And then that leads in discussions, right? With operations, I can say, hey, on the construction side of our business, what does the 10-year runway look like, right? What information are we getting from the manufacturers that would declare that we might need to move in a different direction as far as the tools for the job are, right? That's one set of conversations. However, when you talk to folks like talent acquisition, right, who start to explain to you that finding employees who are technicians first and then need compliance requirements to drive a DOT regulated vehicle, they'll tell you that they are few and far between. So their 5 year lens is, how do we find a way to do our jobs differently that would then allow us to either bring folks into a fast response role and train them to be, larger vehicle drivers, or just change the way that we do business. And then you get into, HR and finance and legal and environmental health and safety and risk management, and having the conversations with each of those folks about what their goals are and what their expectations are 5 to 10 years out gives you a much better understanding for where the organization's going, rather than just picking one stakeholder group or only focusing on operations.
Mm. And you bring up another really great point there, because with the different stakeholder groups, you're going to have differing opinions on common issues that need to be resolved. And one of the topics I'm sure that came up in your discussions and other truck engineering sessions would be this whole issue of standardization. How much do you standardize, and how much can you standardize in the way of assets and equipment? And when you're working with a cross-functional group, as what you've assembled there with 50 people, I mean, theoretically, you could come up with, dozens of different interpretations and recommendations. And how do you go about resolving that and reaching that middle ground where everybody walks away and kind of happy?
I love the question, and I often stop when people talk about standardization. I just think we're using the wrong term.
Okay,
I truly believe it's simplification, right? So
I like that.
we're not getting down to 6 standard vehicles that are going to do the job for all of your business divisions, right? That's not really the end goal. And I
Mhm.
think when we approach it that way, immediately everybody from an operations standpoint, in fact some of the functions as well, will immediately get their guard up and they're like, oh, we can't do our job with the same thing as another. That's not the direction that we need to go at all. It's really about simplifying, right? So when you simplify an asset, it's getting down to what are the 6 or 7 things that this asset does that are similar to the 6 or 7 things that another asset does that we're using 2 different assets. Let's simplify that to a singular simplified asset. And then if there's 10% of that asset from an accessories perspective or upfitting perspective that needs to change, awesome. We've hit as close to euphoria as we're going to get. You don't get the same pushback from the operations. You don't get the same closed off conversations as when you say standardization.
Mhm. I like that approach. So it's more than semantics. It's really identifying those core functions that that asset has to perform and seeing how you can find commonality among the equipment and assets that you're acquiring.
Correct. And the more data we have access to, the easier it is for us to do that, right? So let's say 30% of my business uses a crane truck, right?
Hmm.
Even within that 30%, I'm pretty sure if we're pulling telematics off of, let's say, the crane, the utilization would tell me that there's probably another third of those that we can cut down to a simplified version of that asset that we then use in other places in the business, right? So let's say a technician leaves, we don't have this one of a kind asset sitting on the ground that we can't then leverage for another part of the business. Or we sign a contract, right, for let's say a 3 year contract for a construction project. Because I have a simplified version of my asset, I now have suppliers who are carrying those on ground for me, can pick up the phone, get the simplified asset, and just change the last 10% of the upfitting or accessories on that vehicle, and away we go, right? So we
Hmm.
don't get into order to delivery times and alternate transportation and all that other stuff. And that's all of value to the business.
Sure.
So when you approach it that way, you talk simplification and value to business, it just changes the discussion.
I like that approach, and it streamlines a lot of things. And as you touch, like order to delivery, you take the complexity out of the order, you're going to get those assets a lot quicker.
Correct.
So, what you accomplish in these truck engineering sessions is involving all of the key stakeholders. You have this two-way, open, ongoing dialogue with all of the key stakeholders. And one of the things that I think you possibly do is establish metrics on how you go about accomplishing particular goals. And again, along the lines of the standardization question, you get a lot of different groups there. Metrics for a user group it might be different than metrics for your supplier group. How do you develop the metrics where everybody feels that these metrics are fair and not slanted for one in one way or the other?
If I had the answer to that, so if 2020 has taught us nothing at all, it's that anything is possible, right? And it was actually valuable to me, right? So we have all of this data that comes from all parts of our organization and within our assets. Um, at the end of the day, if you're not aligned to the goals within the organization, if you're not driving operations, or if you're pulling and tracking metrics that nobody else cares about, right? You're not doing any value to the organization. So we had talked earlier about creating the relationships with not only operations, but with all of the other stakeholder groups. Mm-hmm. Fleet often has to become kind of the thread that weaves those folks together, right? So if I'm having a conversation with risk management, right, and we're having an issue from a collisions perspective and third-party liability, right, that's a conversation I now am responsible to carry to HR and talent acquisition, right, and legal and operations, right? And collectively, we get to determine whether that needs to escalate as one of our core goals and therefore become metrics that we measure and do something about. We can't do it all. And I think that's what most people get into, right? So operations will have their set of metrics. They care about P&L. They care about delivery to customer, right? It's all about the customer experience. And we're giving them information about fuel burn. Okay, awesome. Really good information, but not something that they're going to action because it's not in alignment with what their goals are for the year. So until that thread, fleet, mobility, until that thread occurs throughout the organization and those functions, you don't get the alignment. Right. I will tell you that the first probably 60 days of this year was spent doing exactly that for my team and listening to conversations about what people thought their priorities were. We were able to pull 4 metrics that tied directly to goals across the organization, and they're the metrics that we provide. We could provide probably twice as many, 3 times as many metrics, but we're the only ones measuring them. We're the only ones, right, who are interested in them. We've got to go help the business do what they do. Once we get that down, they'll actually be coming to us looking for recommendations as to what to go after.
That's the right formula. And it's really one of the ways that fleet is very powerful within organizations is because all of these other departments and stakeholders need to intersect through fleet. And it gives you a very powerful voice, and especially if you work in a collaborative setting. So I feel that we just scratched the surface on this topic. I'd love to revisit this with you in a follow-up interview, but we've reached our allotted time, Jonathan, and I really want to thank you for a really enlightening conversation, and thank you again for joining us.
I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.